Welcome, everyone, to this fourth session of the day. We have another exciting panel for you all. I'm Chelsea Moon, Head of Learning Development at Enerflo. Batteries are no longer just a backup plan. They're the backbone of the clean energy future. We're talking about cutting-edge storage tech, virtual power plants, and how these innovations are revolutionizing the way that we use and store energy. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator is Pat Bennett, Enerflo co-founder. Our panelists today are Everett Brewer, CEO at Storts Power, and Ed Gunn, VP at Lunar Energy. Before we get into our discussion, let me go ahead and launch a quick poll. Go ahead and just take a moment and answer the two questions there. Would love to get your input. Let's go ahead and look at our results. So, what is the biggest challenge to widespread battery storage adoption? It could be high upfront costs, lack of consumer awareness, or regulatory uncertainties. We got it spread of answers across those. Our second question here was, what will drive increased virtual power plant adoption? And most of you stated utility company collaboration, followed by rising electrical costs. All right, with that, I'm going to hand the reins on over to Pat to kick off this discussion.
Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks, Everett and Ed, for joining today. I'm excited to talk about batteries. A couple years ago, when I entered the solar space, I've been in about 5 years, so I'm not a legend or dinosaur like some of you guys are, but I'm a quick study. So along the years, batteries, honestly, the first couple of years, didn't hear a lot about it. Probably the last 18 months to 2 years, there's been much more discussions and talk, and how do we sell these things, and should we even care? But then still, even today, I was on a trip to the Northeast a few weeks ago, and I was talking to some of our customers there. They have a 1% attachment rate on some of their markets. And other places, you go to California, 20% attachment rate. Ohm Analytics this morning on our other webinar said Texas is approaching a 20% attachment rate, which is crazy. Since last year, it was like a quarter of that. I'd really just like to start. Let's just maybe look at the last couple of years. What are those key drivers that have made people need to care about storage? And also think of it I think in many cases too, batteries being sold as a standalone without solar, because I think a lot of times we always think solar plus storage, but maybe those drivers that are actually making it make sense just as a standalone. And then maybe we just start there, get the lay of land on your two perspectives, and then we'll go from there. Everett, why don't you kick us off here?
Yeah, absolutely. Over the last couple of years, we've just come off of a pretty interesting life cycle here in the United States and across the world, right? To where, whether we like it or not, there was a sense of fear that was in place. And one of those drivers were based around just the overall dependability and resilience of the industry as a whole, right? So people are making decisions, looking for ways to look for just independence in multiple different facets, including energy. And with that being said, that was some of the bigger drivers. And ultimately that kind of dovetails in from even way back in the day when people are pulling car batteries up and plugging them all in and seeing what they can come up with, right? Some backyard engineering from that standpoint. So a lot of that has matured for the sake that there's actually access to the market through energy storage. But the other piece that we've started seeing is that with everything teetering over to more of a TPO product, a lease and PPA type products, then we started seeing some more adoption where a utility company can work with a dozen lenders instead of 100,000 individual homeowners for registering their products. In that case, where we actually start seeing that merger, which we'll get into VPP here in a second, where a small amount of people can get in the same room together and identify the way to leverage each other's assets, and making sure that this is actually efficient with a smaller organization on how dollars are spent and how interconnections are made and how handshakes are between homeowner and utility. And that's opened up a lot more versatility as far as those programs being accessible. And ultimately, some of those savings are being trickled down to the consumer market as well. So I think there's convergence on both sides because policy has been driving it, a lot more wind in the sails from there. We've already read the book and watched the movie in European markets and in Australian markets where they're 15, 20 years ahead of us of learning what not to do is most important, and then ultimately come through and actually building a better solution here in the United States. So those are some key, many to talk about. Those are a couple of drivers that I wanted to touch on.
Yeah, I'll probably dig into a few of those. Ed, you want to add any of those high level as we kick this off?
Yeah, for sure, Pat, and thanks for having me on here. So just to add to whatever it said, he touched on utility rates. We think a lot about utility rate structure as a major driver. We've seen the future in the States because we've seen what's happened in Asia Pacific. We've seen what's happened over in Europe. The rate structures have driven the economic structure, which means that in many states in the US, adding batteries to a solar project makes a ton of sense. It's good for the end customer, lowers their out-of-pocket costs. I think we've seen again in California from if anyone was on the previous session just before us, folks say, what we see in California often echoes around the rest of the states in the US. I'd say what we're seeing in Hawaii over the last 5 years echoes into California and then pushes out across the states. But I think the major driver, the major tipping point is when utilities get behind their rate structures to change rate structures, which mean that batteries now make a ton of sense. I think a weaker driver, but still a driver nonetheless, is certain utility programs. We'll call them VPPs. I think we're going to speak to that in a few minutes. And then I think greater consumer awareness about optionality. So in that sales cycle, in that sales process with a solar company, with a contractor, there's now greater understanding of how to sell batteries into a solar project, although that's very patchy and it's very variable across North America. And there's a greater understanding of how to calculate that value to consumers. I think we'll probably speak more about that today as well.
Yeah, definitely. I actually want to dig into two. So we're talking about grid resilience and the importance of backup. And then we're hitting on actually the self-consumption rate arbitrage, what could happen there. Let's take each of those topics independently. So let's start with grid resilience. I've heard that a lot of the adoption in Texas had to do with resilience, right? Like the storms that happened, people out of power. You look at Puerto Rico, same things happen there. People who had solar and no storage, power lines go down, and all of a sudden they have no energy. I think there was maybe a misconception of how off-grid are you really with just solar. So let's start on that of is natural disasters or local things, or is it more just people understanding that, oh, I can have a battery at my house? What are those things that drive people to make a decision around batteries more for backup and resilience rather than savings? Since there are definitely markets where it doesn't have as large of an impact on savings as other markets. Brett, you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one big driver of adoption has been around affordability, right? So now that we actually have these products that can be financed in the term and the lengths that they have to be able to come in from an adoption standpoint, that's very minimal, right? We all talk about an insurance policy. We'll do that on our car, our homes, ourselves. And this becomes an insurance policy in those markets, not actually not about savings. It's, hey, what were to happen here? I think also too is there's a little bit more awareness that's happening around the overall market because we've got a big flood of information now, so we can actually see what's happening across the entire world just in our handheld. So we can say, hey, infrastructure is under stress right now. We've got all the major data centers that are coming online, AI, which is going to be the biggest consumer of energy throughout the entire globe. What is that going to do in creating pressure, right? When I moved to my hometown or my town right here in Utah, I had no power outages. Now I witness about 6 a month. Sometimes there are blips, 10 minutes, a couple hours, whatever it may be, but that was not my story 12 years ago when I moved to the Utah Valley. And nevertheless, as this at-home worker is also looking for different considerations as far as resilience to be able to make sure I've got income for my family, making sure I'm resilient in different requirements. And interesting enough, in Texas, you brought that up, there was actually a survey that was done during the big freeze that happened about 3.5 years ago. And the number one thing that people actually wish they would have had that they didn't, because those that had generators, those that had battery backup systems, they're grateful for a fridge, they're grateful for lights, for some of those critical load systems. But the number one thing people miss was actually hot water. And you don't think of these different components that actually become really critical to how do you take kids, a bowl of mac and cheese can go a long ways without hot water. So these are different aspects that people are just looking at the simplest form. And in that case, that's also very simple for a message to get to the finish line about too, right? So right now, biggest challenges, which we love why we're having the Solar Connect program going on right now, is that getting information down to the finish line. That message is easily to the finish line. As we get more detailed throughout this session here, That's the stuff that we need to continually educate to get to the finish line. So that way they can see additional reasons, because that becomes an auxiliary benefit for, in addition to what's attracting the pocketbook, on how batteries can bring additional resilience to other areas.
That's great. Ed, what would you add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think the key thing to understand is the US market is different, right? It's a patchwork of lots of micro markets with different drivers, different levers, different force factors, push and pull factors. If you, for example, compare Puerto Rico, you're having outages every day. There will be an outage every day. It'll be more rare that days that there are not outages. Whereas if you speak to some pockets of California, even Texas, there is some relatively resilient grids. Where I came from, Scotland, right? My hometown is Scotland. From back in the day, we never had outages. I think we had 2 outages my whole life. Having moved to California, I was expecting, a few years back, I was expecting outages all the time because I had been part of the industry selling grid resilience or storage resilience, being an OEM player. And there were remarkably few. But I think it is the perception from an end customer's perspective, it's the perception of control and control over one of the most important things that means something to their family. It's to their children, it's to their partner, it's to their family and friends that come and visit. And it may be more real or more perceived depending on the market. But in any case, backup will remain not necessarily a backbone, but one of the core drivers for wanting to add storage to a solar project, which is why we're seeing certain markets which have a remarkably resilient grid, relatively consistent grid, having much increased battery attachment rates to their solar projects over the last 18 to 24 months. You'll then look at, like I said, markets like Puerto Rico or Hawaii, where the grid is pretty unstable and you're getting close to 100% residential battery attachment rates in those markets. Whereas we talked earlier in the previous question that maybe a more major driver in some of the more stable grid states is the utility adoption of smart utility rates that speak to adding storage to a solar project.
Awesome. So let's shift to savings. Then we'll get into VPP because that obviously ties into a lot of what we're talking about. With markets changing to net billing, with obviously NIM rates, time of use, things like that. First, I think it'd be good. Again, we're trying to educate, right? That's what Solar Connect's all about. Let's first try to educate anyone listening who may not understand kind of the calculus problem that you have to solve when rates are different, either time of day or import export is different, and how having a battery can actually be an additional savings. So even though you're adding 10 grand to the project cost, you actually will have additional savings than you could get with just solar alone. Who wants to take a stab at explaining the math at a high level for people to understand?
You got it, Ed. Take the first crack.
Sure, thanks, Everett. Bottom line is with the move to net billing tariff, or in California, we called it NEM 3. It's got different names across different states in North America. It means that just having solar, where previously your solar payments, your solar return on investment as an end customer would be based on the export rate. And it was essentially, because the export rate and the import rates were balanced, it was essentially the grid was acting as your battery, right? And the grid was the most efficient battery based on those rates. But in the move to net billing or NEM 3, what happens is the export rate is cut massively. So there's now a significant difference between the import rate, what you're paying per kilowatt hour per unit of electricity, and the export rate, what you're getting for discharging energy to the grid or exporting your excess solar to the grid. And what you then need, if the grid is not therefore acting as your battery, which can push and pull the exports and imports to and from your home, you need your own battery. And that is the kind of founding principle of why batteries are needed under these new net billing rates or NEM 3 rates. Now, every state has adopted slightly different, every state that's moved to net billing has adopted slightly different rate structures. And this is all the mechanics behind the scenes. These utilities spend a lot of money buying MBA grads, really good financial engineers who may not know what an end customer looks like. They may not know, they definitely don't know what an installer looks like. They don't speak installer, they don't speak batteries. They are very smart financial engineers. And of course, they're not necessarily acting in the best interest of the end customer. All right. So what they have done with these complicated mechanics is try to in incentivizing the use of batteries or distributed energy resources into the customer homes, they've tried to also support the grid at peak times. Those peak times during the day are, the evening peak where everyone gets home from work, whacks on electrical devices in their home, puts the dinner on, that sort of thing. And the grid is genuinely under stress in those times. Electricity peaks in price, and therefore it is useful for the utility to reduce the usage of electricity during those times. And that reduced usage can come from the battery discharging into the home or the battery discharging into the grid, and essentially reducing the home's impact on the grid. And to do that, though, your battery needs a level of intelligence. It needs to be smart. It needs to be able to understand the various electricity rates available, and it needs to operate or behave differently depending on the import and export prices at any one time. And what's been really interesting in the last 12 to 18 months when we've seen the rollout of these net billing rates across some of the North American states, some of the US states, is that while it's made batteries an essential part of the solar project, it's also differentiated between batteries that can play within this new, more complex structure and batteries that maybe struggle to keep up. So it's really important, and speaking to two great battery companies here, Lunar Energy and Stores Power, it's really important that those batteries can play with those smart rates. And what it means, to boil it down, is as an OEM, you cannot no longer be just a hardware player. You have to have really good software that controls the battery to act in the best interests of your end customer. And so from an installer's perspective, installers up and down the country are deciding which batteries to choose to sell to their customers. It's really important for installers to understand that the choices they make on which OEM they go with, it's not just the hardware. It's not just the spec sheet that they're selling. It's having that confidence that the OEM has fantastic software that is, some people call it net billing ready or NEM3 ready, to optimize or control the behavior of the battery around those more complicated rates. And I think that's the minimum bar, that's table stakes, right? These new net billing rates change every year. So you will have as an installer, contractor EPCs listening to the session today, you will have 2024 customers who you PTO'd in 2024. They're your 2024 vintage. You'll have 2025 customers you're PTOing now. You've done the first 6 weeks of the year. You're going to have 2026 customers, and each one of those customers will have a very different rate structure. It will still be under net billing tariff, for example, a net billing tariff rate structure, but it will have a different mechanics, different numbers behind the scenes. And so it's even more important that the OEM you choose to work with, the battery you choose to work with, has software that can cope with the changing the annual changes that come into those rates. And it's a really hard and increasingly complex purchasing environment for any procurement professionals on the call today. But it's the key thing to ask when you're making those procurement decisions is, hey, can you walk me through how your battery copes with NEM3 or net billing? How does it benefit my end customer? As an installer, how do I have surety and peace of mind that the batteries are operating correctly? Can I see data? Can I see telemetry? Can I see actual dollars and cents savings from my customer's perspective? These are all key questions and quite easy questions to ask your OEM provider.
Awesome. No, so I think you broke down really well how net billing rates can affect savings and how batteries can, you buy a battery, you become your own grid in a sense. And so you can actually combine resiliency with savings, right? Because it's, hey, not only are you going to become more independent and not rely on the grid for any excess solar, but you can store and buy that back from yourself. Now, I want to get into what you were talking about with the actual batteries themselves. Before I do, part of it is actually in the sales process forecasting what savings may look like. Now, California is looking to pass a bill. We were talking about this earlier with Julia Piper, or not a bill, but a new consumer protection document. And in that document, and this could go into effect in June, the sales rep would actually have to provide 3 savings calculations based on 3 different operating modes of the battery to show for first year kind of savings for the customer. And so as we've tried to tackle this problem, and I know other people in the software space, you basically have to run a model where you look at every hour for 25 years. That's 216,000 hours where you have to look at, okay, this time of day, am I going to have excess power? Am I importing? Am I exporting? If I'm importing, what's my rate? If I'm exporting, what's my rate? And it's very complicated and it's tricky. So putting that aside, again, on the sales side, education, software tools, getting up to speed, just ensuring the sale is done in a way that the consumer understands, okay, here's the impact a battery could have on me. Am I buying this for savings? Am I buying it for backup? Am I buying it for resiliency? And that transparency is super important for consumer protection. What I want to jump to then, Everett, is I could sell to a consumer some type of savings plan. They go into their app and they change the operating mode, and everything goes out the window. So, how do you balance the intelligence a battery can do with maybe what the consumer thinks they're purchasing? And as a sales rep or an installer, like ensuring, or I don't know if it's ensuring, but just putting your best foot forward when those scenarios can definitely come up.
I think the first thing is that we have to start changing the culture from a sales standpoint of accounting for not selling from your own back pocket. Because what we've seen already in NEM3, for example, is that in the last 12 months, we've now seen quite some time go by with NEM3. We're starting to see the outcomes of utility bills after NEM3. And because these guys were selling the smallest battery possible and didn't have the proper education of having the proper configuration and sizing to accomplish the end goals of savings for combating NEM3, is folks are getting massive true-up bills. I've been interfaced with a multitude of actual statements from California users right now because they only put in a battery with a certain profile, and we've got to shift that. Is don't be afraid of those extra 5, 10, 15, 20, even 40, $50,000, because ultimately I'm seeing true-up bills, no joke, anywhere from $17 to $3,000 of true-up bills that are happening in this case. And just the net billing aspect of it, where they're getting month over month bills that are extremely high. And the fixes actually add more storage. And that increase in payment over the amount of savings is just an easy conversation to have. So with that being said, if we can actually adjust that culture for education of the application, to Ed's point, is that working with your OEM, understanding profile, and then making sure that we're working with the design and proposal tools like yourself, Pat, where we can actually make sure that the performance is built in there. You touch on one really good piece, is that bringing in the hourly data, right? In some markets, it's 15-minute data, even gets bigger line items to cross-reference. But the convenience in that scenario is that there's nothing left for a question mark. You actually are getting a really good overlay of how much the consumption really is, how much solar is going to actually generate, and then ultimately how energy storage is going to be maximized. Many a time we see that the consumer really ends up having certain usage profiles in certain seasons of the year to where they need additional solar system as well as the battery capacity to capture it, right? And so I think it's going to be really key that kind of nexus happens over the very near future, because I come from the commercial background, right? I've been working with what we call interval data. It's 15, 30-minute, 1 hour snapshots um, for the entire 12 months. And that's how we're accounting for tackling demand charges, tackling the time of use rates, and setting expectations. And the results have been is that I'm hitting that right on the money. We haven't had any customers not see the net savings that they're looking for. So I'm actually excited for that transfer of information and focus in the residential market, because the commercial rate's been around forever. They're actually just trickling down to the end of the residential market. And ultimately, it's going to improve the overall focus of design proposal tools, the sales rep education point, and then obviously the OEM and improving software and controls mechanisms that actually ensure that to happen. But you're exactly right. Consumers can get a hold of that unit and flip that thing on its head, and all of a sudden the outcomes are totally different. And again, us as OEMs, we have tracks and measures on that. We know who pushed a button, what we did that, and there's an accountability point that would have to be there. But yet, I think through policy and through those, because I was aware of that, those three different savings mechanisms, there's a level of accountability that needs to happen on the consumer side, but there's also accountability on the sales rep side, making sure that's properly presented. Welcome calls, making sure that people are aware of what they're signing up for, and then obviously how we actually progress that over time. And nothing wrong with doing a little health check over time, right? Energy profiles change. I had an electric vehicle. I went all electric appliances. Like in Colorado, you can get up to $33,000 in a check from the state to get away from gas and go electric. What's that going to do? Totally different energy profile in that case. And so we've got to make sure we're evolving And that's where this is not just a one-stop sale. This is a progressive relationship that you can maintain with the consumer and make sure that growth opportunity is along for the ride.
That's awesome. Yeah, a lot of great points there. Let's talk about, because we were talking about evolution and things changing. Let's talk about VPPs now. Let's pretend people listening have no ideas what a VPP is, because in many cases it's not in their market. It's not where they sell. There's more and more coming online, it seems. But help people understand what these things are and then how that's actually driving battery adoption forward. And we'll get into that discussion.
Yeah, I'll kick this off. Thanks, Pat. So I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about VPPs. And let's just try and break it down really simply. It's easy to get tripped up by this. So VPP, that stands for virtual power plant. Now, it's not a real power plant because it's virtualized. It's the control of lots of different small devices, so small batteries or even small EV chargers, small thermostats in people's homes. We'll keep it residentially focused for now. In people's homes, and using software to connect all of those individual devices together. And if you connect a lot of different devices or different devices that have capacity together, that have a number of kilowatt hours in them, or a number of kilowatts of control, you can move from 5 kilowatt hours to a megawatt, or a megawatt hour, or 5 megawatt hours worth of capacity. And that's why people talk about it as a virtual power plant, because power plants are big. They're multiple megawatts of power, multiple megawatt hours of duration. So from a consumer perspective, a VPP is, I've bought this device, it's been installed by my local contractor. Maybe it's been via a TPO financing route through a Sonova or Sunrun or Enfin type organization. And this device sits in my home, and most of the time, this battery is saving me money. We talked a wee bit about how it saves money. It charges up, it discharges, and it solves my evening peak or my morning load or whatever, my background home load. But sometimes, if it's enrolled in a VPP, sometimes that battery can do something else. Sometimes that battery can dispatch power to the grid when the grid needs it. And if you are dispatching power to the grid as part of a proper program, a thing that you have signed up for, that you've read terms and conditions for, that you've clicked the I accept button, you and maybe hundreds or maybe even thousands of other customers, other end consumers, homeowners, are going to have your batteries discharging roughly all at the same time for this specific program. So we call that a VPP. Some people call it grid services. Some people call it flex, because ultimately you're flexing different people's batteries. And there is money available, right? And let's follow the money for a second. So we'll go back to that customer experience perspective. So you as a customer, you've had this battery installed, and at the point of install, because your installer had a little bit of understanding about the various VPPs available in your territory, in your area. Let's say you're in Northern California, and the installers encouraged you to sign up to the PG&E program, one of the PG&E programs. That's great. So from time to time, your battery will be called upon to dispatch power into the grid, and you will be compensated for it. Okay, so that's great. You will be compensated for it. It will help pay down the cost of the battery. But let's just pause on that for a second. So the compensation routes are complicated and vary completely across the states in the US. It's very dependent on where you live, so where your battery has been installed. Do you live in Northern California? Do you live in Massachusetts? Do you live in Utah? Each state, each location within a state can have its own VPPs available, its own programs to sign up to. And some don't have any available, right? Then the question of financing of the product itself, financing the battery. Did you pay for the battery yourself? Or did you get a no money down deal through one of the TPO providers? If you had a no money down deal, some of the TPO providers offer their own VPPs and would have the ability to control the battery, and you sign up at the point of sale, and as part of getting the no money down option or no money down offer, the TPO can control your battery as part of the VPP. And you may get some revenue, you may get some revenue share, or you may not get very much at all. If you own the battery yourself, you then, and which means you can control what you do with your battery. You have an option to sign up to programs, but you may not want to, or you may not have availability of information to say, I don't know which programs are in my area. And this is why it's really important from the contractor, EPC, installation side, installer side, that the installers have that education and have that their availability, that intel, that knowledge of what programs that their customers have the option to sign up to. And then compensation. The structure of VPP compensation and the structure of the money, the structure of the revenue is really, again, super complex. There's no one size fits all. So for example, there are some VPP programs out there which will offer upfront incentives and ongoing incentives. So the upfront incentives may be a few $1,000s to do a solar storage project if you sign up for the VPP at point of sale. And then for every year that you remain in that VPP, that you make your battery available to dispatch to the grid, you may get an ongoing payment, an ongoing incentive payment. And they can be quite lucrative in some markets. We see some of the Massachusetts VPPs are very lucrative, can pay off the battery within 5 years. The Duke Energy, North Carolina markets, again, can pay off the battery very quickly. And we're seeing some not quite as rich, but some other really interesting programs in California popping up, which can pay down the battery, but over a number of years. But I think the thing I want to leave folks with is it's massively variable depending on which state you're in. It's massively variable within states. And installers, we as Lunar Energy always try to educate our install partners as to which programs are available for their end customer, because there's a lack of information, a lack of clarity as to what customers can sign up for and what this really means from an economics perspective. And I think, Pat, that goes back to platforms like Enerflo. I think you have a really important role to play as part of the sales experience, as part of the sales journey for sales folks from installers to help them sell this benefit to customers in a really easy fashion. Because again, with lack of information, it can feel very complex when really it should be very simple. Customer, if you sign up for this program X, it will reduce the cost of your battery up front and you will make X $100 per year for the next 5 years. It should be as simple as that. And that should be built in, that simplicity should be built in at the point of sale through that sales journey.
Great. No, that's great content. So Everett, as you've seen these VPPs come online, where are the major ones that you're aware of and how do installers find out about them? Ed was mentioning like how hard it is just to get information. Are there sites people can go look them up? How do you talk to your local utility? Like, how do you even find out about these things and make sure that your customers are taking part of them?
Yeah, absolutely. First, start with your OEM, right? In this case, those VPPs are going to be registered with the OEM, which is the registered asset in the field, no matter who owns it, whether it's a TPO or a homeowner. So that's the number one place to start. You've got platforms such as like Ohm Analytics you brought up earlier. Great friends with those guys, incredible in what they do. They've actually got an overarching overall program. Some of those programs are BYOB, bringing your own battery, to different ones have upfront incentives. Those are the kind of pay-as-you-go type programs. And that's a really good resource to see overarching what it's in. And then that way it'll give you a purpose, say, hey, I'm going to reach out to my OEM, my battery manufacturer partner, and say, hey, I recognize that this is actually listed and available in my local market. Are you guys part of this program, or can you get registered for these programs? To Ed's point, these programs are ever changing. They come and they go as well, right? They get superseded by other programs. We've also seen some failures of programs being launched. We've seen Hawaii with that failure. We've seen San Diego with that failure, where they think the economics would incentivize the consumer, actually are not that way in real life on the other side of the fence, right? Ed talked about is a lot of those MBAs that never even know what an installer is, or let alone realize the real data that's on the ground, right? Hand doesn't talk to left hand, happens often. But with that being said, don't be opposed to actually reach out to us saying, hey, just came from a meeting. Hey, I just had a homeowner. Hey, I was on the utility website applying for interconnection and this popped up. It is constantly changing. Let us know. We're incentivized to get these assets listed in as many locations as possible, because we're really the sales enablement asset class to make sure you guys have progressive approaches through this. And the other piece too is that don't be opposed to, in particular meetings, is throw that plug in. Hey, I know a guy. I'm good friends with Ed. I'm good friends with Everett. Where have you guys ever thought about some of these programs before? And sometimes that right then and there comes down to where They didn't maybe think that they had a path forward, that their infrastructure is not ready. They have goals and wishes, but how do they get there? Right now, we're seeing a lot of that happening with tribes in the United States, actually, where you're trying to get these utilities to be more independent, where it's tribal owned utilities and they don't know how to move forward with that. There's programs and software and solutions that we have available to progress those opportunities for all features involved. Quick note is why this makes sense is a utility company doesn't make sense for them to actually own a battery, right? Because for one, they don't have the installation network. That's where you guys come in. They don't have the service network. That's where you guys come in. They don't really have access to the financing for secondary assets like this in the field, where they can go and pay for this upfront expense, where the utility company is gladly willing to do a handshake agreement with whoever owns that battery at the end of the business or the home. Is simply the fact is you're giving them a pay-as-you-go program. So where, hey, I need this because this event happened. I had a grid failure. I actually have additional pressure in this area than we initially anticipated. We had a big heat spell. We had a big freeze spell. And in this case, I've got to balance out the grid. They can actually reach out and grab into that asset and provide value. And when you guys do that, a lot of people get a little skittish. Some cases like, hey, I don't want people just reaching into my battery and taking all my power. What happens if they take it all and I no longer have any left for my own needs and my own targets and goals? But at the end of the day is that it's actually massive impact because those batteries in aggregate between both us manufacturers here on this call, we can literally provide safety of lives and peace of mind and ultimately critical infrastructure across the United States is where you're actually contributing to society instead of being a consumer of society. And I think that's really important to understand the kind of higher purpose of why this all makes sense and being a part of the solution and making sure that your education of, hey, this doesn't just only help you, but your neighbor down the street. There's also a key case. Example, Texas had a project down there, power went out. What happened? The neighbor didn't have a generator nor battery. And the buddy of mine that had the really big system ran a power cord all the way to the neighbor's house. And next to that power outage for 6 days, he was able to maintain key essential food in the fridge for and medical devices and all those kind of things. That's why we actually do this at the end of the day. But I think that's just really important to understand that. But through these programs, Pat, through like the Enerflo platform, I think it's also important is that the VPP doesn't take away from other key opportunities like NEM3. I got to make sure that battery is tackling those big 40 and 63 cents kilowatt hour in the afternoon hours. But then all of a sudden the utility comes up there and grabs it and takes it away. Like all of a sudden I just picked up a bill for what I came up over here. There's a really good balance that also needs to be considered as well. So I think we'll see a lot of more progress on that position with the modeling and through design and proposal tools that will make that all valid for all players.
I think with the popularity of like ride sharing and Airbnb and stuff, we should just call it battery sharing, and people might actually know what it means. So
Hey,
yeah, that's a good point.
I wanted to jump in on a couple of things Everett brought up. I thought just really quickly, I know we're coming up against time. By the way, battery share, love it.
Yeah.
Our solution to battery share, like our VPP platform, is called Grid Share. So
Okay.
maybe we should have changed it to its name to battery share, but Grid Share, you're sharing something with the grid
Yeah.
and you're being compensated for it. But I think talking about where the intel is from, where do you get the information from, the low level of understanding from an end consumer's perspective to an installer's perspective, even certain OEMs, right? So I think that also breeds a level of distrust. And if we think about who are the actors in an end customer's journey, like their electrification journey, you have the utility, consistently low levels of distrust for their utility. In California and certain other states, you have community choice aggregators. There's a relatively high trust in CCAs, but there's low understanding or low clarity from consumers of which CCA they're with. They don't even know that they're in a CCA territory. They think they get all of their bill from PG&E, when actually they get some of it from PG&E and some of it from AVA in the East Bay. And then OEMs, there's like a distance between the customer and the OEM. And our thesis is actually the people who have the strongest trust with an end customer are installers. They are installers. Jimmy, Jack, John, whoever's come across that threshold in the customer's property has been to site, has spent a long time selling and helping that customer understand their purchase journey, their electrification journey. And so we see it as really important when we are advising utilities and we're advising CCAs on the design of those battery programs to not just listen to us. We've been doing this for nearly 2 decades now, but to listen to installers. And so bringing installers in to say, hey, this design would really help me sell more products, or this design would really help me explain to customers when I'm over the threshold as part of the sales process. So thinking about who has the best trust with those end customers and who can drive signups to VPPs at the right way, in the right time, at the right place with the right information, I think is really key. And as I said, I think installers hold an amazing and a very important place in that.
Yeah, we talked earlier on the policy one of just the importance of everyone in the industry being part of all these discussions so that these decisions aren't made in a vacuum and everyone has a seat at the table. So I think getting involved is super critical. With the couple minutes we have left, I want to hit some rapid fire ones that we didn't touch on. So maybe you guys can answer these in 30 seconds or so, but a lot of buzz around domestic content. People use that term. A lot of people, again, might not even know what that means, especially like VPPs. If we're forecasting forward, I know in a lot of ways, we don't know what the Trump administration is going to do. We don't know how they're going to touch the IRA. I don't know that everybody even understands how domestic content, like if I'm an installer, how domestic content actually affects me. But maybe just with relating to batteries and how you guys view that and how an everyday installer should care about the impacts of domestic content changes may have on their business.
Yeah, if I could just put one big word on it, premature. There's a lot of key infrastructure here that is lacking, missing, and still yet to be built and to be identified. And ultimately, you've got to find economic value and incentive for that to actually happen, right? The domestic content, however, is a high priority for, I could probably honestly say, every manufacturer inside the United States for just the sake of security, right? We've actually seen espionage happen in multiple different areas. If you remember, there was actually a government facility installation done in the Carolinas where a key partner from China was installed. And despite the fact it was actually already installed and turned on, they're required to decommission it and pull that out. And this was a tens of millions of dollars infrastructure play for the sake of security and some of the concerns there. We're starting to see a lot of that security concern come into where it's coming in the forms of chips. Everything is software enabled nowadays, right? There's no such thing as just a lead acid battery that connects to a vehicle nowadays. We're really technology companies that actually build batteries. And so we've got to make sure we're actually making sure that consideration is placed. So at minimum, domestic content does need to be heavily considered in time, but more importantly is first and foremost, which is the quick and fast approach to the market, is software control, security measures that hit between that. Because right now the products are being procured outside of the United States for the most part. And then as we start seeing cell supply and different type of raw material supply start and infrastructure increasing here in the United States, then we'll see that actually full on transition. But right now we're seeing people that are starting to pull out of investments here because of the uncertainty or putting things on pause. So I think the financing market's the first one that was the big driver for it. Financiers like, hey, I'm just trying to do a grab because a lot of TPOs can monetize additional tax credits and incentives for that side because it's a commercial owned asset where a residential homeowner cannot. And so with some of the potential rate schedules and interest rates adjusting here in the near future, we can start seeing some lending creativity happening. So start increasing a higher transaction type. Those incentives become less incentivized because a consumer cannot monetize those. And I think we'll start seeing a little more balance, a little bit less pressure on us again to trying to speed up because nobody's in a hurry for failure at this point. And so we got to slow it down, make some calculations and progress to the next step.
Maybe to throw in another word on top of whatever it said is uncertainty. I think you used uncertainty a couple of times, Everett, in your answer. It's just super uncertain. As OEMs, we're making 12, 18, 24, 36-month bets on supply chain manufacturing decisions. And it's tricky when you just can't see the future, right? And you don't feel like there's a lot of certainty in policy. I think installers should care. And I think Made in America is a really important message. I think it's important for energy security, American energy security. It's important for American energy independence. And we would like to just see more certainty in the policies around that. I think while there is uncertainty now, I think it's also a point of competitive difference with OEMs. We as an OEM are North America made. We have manufacturing facilities in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was tricky to set up, but we believe in that as a policy. The trouble is it's the TPOs that benefit, as Everett said. It's not what we call the strong tail of installers, that long tail of installers that some of which Enerflo serves, that can really benefit from that on a cash and loan sales basis. So I'd like to see a rebalancing on that so it puts the value in a wider group of installers' hands.
Yeah, you brought up some points. Sweet, well, we're coming up on time. I don't know if we have any burning Q&A questions we need to answer, but I think we hit on a lot of the key topics that I wanted to make sure we covered today. So we appreciate you guys jumping on and having the discussion. And I think what we can all agree if forecast in the future is batteries are here to stay. VPPs are going to keep growing. Net billing and utility rates will continue to come into play in new states, and rates will continue to increase. And it really is important for sales reps and installers to get a good hold of what that value prop is of a battery in their local market, whether that's VPP, resilience, backup, self-consumption, arbitrage, because it does vary by market. And so education, training, all those things are super critical. But thanks again, guys, for joining today and appreciate the discussion.